Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargav, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about the latest developments in the India China border crisis. We also look back at the life of the former president Pranab Mukherjee. But first, we talk about the economy. On Monday, the data released by the National Statistical Office showed that India's gross domestic product growth, or GDP growth, contracted 23.9% in the April June quarter. This has been the lowest growth rate since India started reporting quarterly data in 1996, and the sharpest GDP contraction among the top 20 global economies so far. During the COVID 19 induced lockdowns, people had anticipated that India's growth rate would slow down, and there were indicators pointing in that direction. Moreover, India's economy had already been slowing down before the pandemic hit.
In fact, in the last financial year, we decelerated quite sharply, and we ended the year with just 4% growth.
That's Udit Mishra, who reports on the economy for the Indian Express.
In the last quarter of the last financial, which was January and March, we grew at just about 3%. And even this 3% was considered to be an overestimate. The fact is that Indian economy had been slowing down for a while. But the COVID crisis, what it has done is that instead of just slowing down, sort of growing at a slower rate, now we have started contracting, which is to say that when we talk about the GDP contraction, that basically means that the total value of goods and services that were produced in this quarter, in April to June quarter this year, were 23.9 or 24% broadly lower than the total value of goods and services that we produced in the same 3 months in last year.
Most people had expected a contraction due to the COVID 19 crisis, but the broader consensus was that it would not exceed 20%. But the contraction of 23.9% is what has now, Udit says, broadened our understanding of the problem.
So all of a sudden, from an economy which was from one quarter to another growing at a slower pace, after COVID, we have become an economy which has started contracting and contracting at a very sharp pace. I mean, imagine growing at 24% to contracting at 24%. And now, typically, there is one set of policy tools that are required to sort of boost the growth level of an economy which is sort of slowing down. And from there, another set would be required to boost growth.
Meanwhile, one impact Udit says this will have is that the unemployment rate, which is already at a 4-decade high, would become worse, and even more people will lose jobs. And unemployment, as we have discussed previously, affects almost every aspect of a person's life, including health. And this situation, he says, is likely to worsen.
So, this is a historic event for us because since 1991, when we liberalized and opened up our economy, we have grown on an average at 7% every year. Some years more than that, some years less than that, but on an average, roughly around 6.87%. And this year, the conservative estimate would be that we'll contract by 7%. So not grow by 7, but actually contract by 7. And possibly the more you hear about these estimates, they may actually go up to 10, 12 or thereabout. There is also worry that if the government doesn't take action right now, this contraction may extend for more quarters. It may not just be a story of the first quarter. It may become a story which sustains. And for 2, 3, 4, even 6 or 8 quarters, it stays in that phase. And that, again, in incomes and jobs and the kind of economic stress, health stress that would create for an economy like ours, which has lakhs of people joining labor force every month, that's a massive concern.
Udit says that the government would like to believe, or perhaps would like to show, that the reason for this is only the COVID crisis. After all, the pandemic has demolished economies world over. And one of the ways to stop the virus from spreading was to hold back economic activities. And that's true. COVID has had a big role to play. But India's economy, as pointed out earlier, was already slowing down, and hence our resilience to suffer the hit by COVID 19 was pretty low. Firms and banks had already been struggling, he says.
Even government, which could possibly mount a fight back on this was already struggling before the crisis. So because its revenues and its borrowings were already overextended, revenues were falling and borrowings were rising and they were beyond the prudential norms, that we found that the government has been dithering in making an investment to the economy and leading to a fight back. Unlike most other governments which have had the wherewithal to sort of attack the problem more directly and control COVID. The control of COVID is again a big factor here.
Udit says that the data points to the fact that every sector of the economy, barring agriculture, has shrunk.
Agriculture has grown by 3.4%, which is a good enough number, but it's not a remarkable number. It's not like, our target typically for agriculture has always been 4%. So it is below 4%, but still 3.4 is a decent number. But across the board, elsewhere, sectors have shrunk. Basically, their outputs have gone down. Their incomes would have shrunk massively. And the key important thing to note here is that the sectors which create the maximum new jobs in the economy are the ones which are most hit. So across skill levels, if you look at it from absolutely unskilled laborer to high skilled workers, the sectors that are hit the most are construction, which is down 50%, trade, hotels, and other such services, which is down 47%. There is manufacturing, which is, I think, down 39%, almost 40%. There is mining and quarrying, which is down 23%. So across the board, even the government, public administration sector, the data is showing has contracted, which is to say that even the government has failed to raise as much output as it did in the same 3 months last year. So it is quite a bleak scenario.
The contraction of 23.9% tells us, of course, that the demand has shrunk and how it has impacted all the sectors that Udit just talked about and their outputs. But there is also a lot that it doesn't reveal, like the exact impact on employment, for example. And more importantly, Udit says that the way these statistics are structured, they do not adequately cover the informal sector, which by definition is not formally registered. And this is important because 90% of India's workforce is in the informal sector.
Now, as we saw with the case of, say, demonetization, the data did not adequately capture the destruction that happened in informal economy. So on the face of it, the GDP data did not, that year when demonetization happened, our economy on paper grew by 8.3%. But the fact is that the informal economy got destroyed in that process. And over the next 1, 2, 3 years, that crisis snowballed. And now we are all suffering because of the after effects of that. So often what this data does not capture is the informal economy. And that's the big worry. Over time, we'll find different proxies also because right now we are not capturing as much data as we can because of the lockdown itself. As time goes by, we'll get more details and we'll get to know what was the real impact in terms of consumption in the informal sector. And chances are that that might have fallen further. So these numbers may be revised downwards again.
Now the question is, what is the way out of this? How can India boost growth at this time? Udit says that there are essentially 4 engines of growth in the economy. The biggest being private consumption, essentially what people demand and spend, but that has collapsed nearly 27% during the COVID crisis, especially because incomes are also down. Then there's investments that businesses can make, and that has collapsed almost 50%. The third is import and exports, but that makes up only a tiny portion of India's GDP.
So the only engine of growth, as it were, is government. And the solution, the way out for Indian economy is that the government spends. If the government does not spend more, then this economy will take its own sweet time, which could be a very painful, long period for recovery. It could be 4 years, it could be 5 years, whatever. If we want the recovery to happen sooner, we must have a government which actually spends quickly and in a substantial amount. The longer it delays, and we've said this thing in the past episodes of the podcast, that the longer it takes for the government to take action, the worse the situation will get. And the worse it gets, the more money you will actually require to address the problem.
And to spend, of course, the government should also have money. And right now, it is already under substantial debt. And usually, there are norms as to how much the government can borrow from the central bank. But in a crisis such as this, Udit says, those norms are typically abandoned. Because if the government doesn't spend, the economy would be in a lull for a much longer period.
Government is the only economic agent in an economy which is not constrained by what is there in its pocket, in the sense that, first of all, it can be very innovative with what it can do with its own assets. So government can sell a lot of land or monetize many of its assets like companies or shares of companies and get money. So it can get money from those sources. And last but not the least, very crucially, in a crisis, a government can actually resort to printing more money and using that to invest in the economy. Now, as long as it is done in a careful manner and it is seen as a one time move, governments should actually do that in a crisis. If they do not do it, then the whole process will take that much longer. If they do it, the economy can come out of the slump sooner and resume normal activity. And when it resumes normal activity and the taxes start flowing back to the government can use that money and pay back the loan.
Moreover, Udit says that the government, depending on how it chooses to spend the money, has a multiplier effect. For example, if it spends 100 rupees, it could turn it into a 250 rupees GDP.
If you give 100 rupees as a dole out, it has one level of multiplier, which is smaller. And if it builds a bridge, it has a different multiplier. If you build a bridge, it is better than giving 100 rupees to some poor person directly, because building a bridge also allows economic activity to happen, facilitates greater economic activity. So it sort of has a salutary impact, more GDP is created. So this is very important. And the funny thing is that, analysis shows us that if the government does not spend money today in the notion that our total debt is a very high proportion of our total GDP, then what will happen is that even with the same level of debt, because the GDP will keep shrinking as it has shrunk in the last quarter, the debt to GDP ratio will actually increase. Because, for the same absolute amount of debt, your GDP is shrinking. But if the government was to invest right now by borrowing, by increasing the debt, so you may end up with a higher level of absolute amount of debt. But that investment, if it boosts the GDP and boosts the GDP, making it bigger, then the debt to GDP may, in the couple of years, actually reduce. So it's a tough call for any government, but I think it's a call that most governments are taking. Even when they do not have resources, they are pushing for those things. India, in particular, must do it as early as possible.
Dear listeners, sorry for this interruption, but before we move on to the rest of the show, I just wanted your quick attention. One of the big reasons people say they like this show is because it helps them understand the news better. It provides them with the context they need to see the bigger picture. And there is perhaps no other place that does that better than Indian Express's Explained section. We on Three Things refer to the section regularly, and it helps us make this show. If you're a regular reader of Indian Express, you know how useful the Explained section can be, especially when you're looking for in-depth analysis by the right experts. You can log on to indianexpress.com/explained and access the coverage 24/7. Explained by Indian Express, where news that matters is explained by experts who know the subject. Now, back to the show. Next, we talk about the India-China border crisis. For nearly 4 months now, the standoff between India and China has not been resolved. As discussed previously on the podcast, the Chinese have transgressed along at least 4 points on the LAC in eastern Ladakh: Pangong Tso, the Galwan Valley, Hot Springs, and Depsang. But on Monday morning, China tried to create a fresh trouble at a new point, and this was at the south bank of the Pangong Tso Lake. Until now, troops were facing off on the north bank of the lake, where the Chinese have not disengaged. This area has been a major point of contention between the two sides. In this segment, we speak to Krishan Kaushik, who reports on matters of defense for the newspaper, about what we know about the situation right now. And he first points out that there are very few hard facts available in the public domain. And the facts that are available have either come from the Indian Army or the statements issued by the Chinese side.
So definitely there was some military action on the intervening night of Saturday and Sunday. That's over this weekend. Indian Army has said that they preempted Chinese movement. They said through their ISR activities, that is intelligence, surveillance, and recce, they could find that a body of Chinese troops was moving to occupy a previously undeployed location, which is why they preempted that move and have gone and occupied certain locations that puts the Indian Army in an advantageous position. It means that they have occupied certain heights through which they can keep an eye on the Chinese movement and essentially also dominate the passes that are there in that area and the Spangur Gap, which is a 2-kilometer wide valley in the Trishul approach area.
He says that the Indian Army has been clear that the Indian side has not crossed the LAC, that is, the Indian perception of the LAC. Krishan also points out that the standoff between the two sides had actually started after there was a clash between the troops in the north bank of Pangong Tso.
So while the standoff has traveled further up north up to the Depsang Plains, it's the first time that the standoff has traveled south in the last 4 months. Now, the northern bank of Pangong Tso has a lot of spurs, which are called fingers, and China has built a black-topped road till Finger 4, where they claim the LAC lies. They can come in Humvees, but the area on the north bank of Pangong Tso is not conducive for a full-blown aggressive attack. But the southern bank of Pangong Tso, because the hills or the mountains, on the southern bank, they slope towards Spangur Lake, which is where the Spangur Gap lies. That in 1962 as well was also used as a launch pad for an offensive attack, which is always a threat. So it's important that India dominates that area to avoid any proper offensive attack in case a larger military conflict breaks out. Which is also the reason why since 1962 onwards, the southern bank of the Pangong Tso, going down from there, had much better and stronger presence of the Indian Army, and India has dominated this area the last 45 years. So this current standoff, when it travels to the southern bank, it gains significance because any further escalation due to the mistrust between the two forces and the two countries, or any sudden action by either of the two militaries, can really escalate very quickly now.
It is also interesting to note what the Chinese English language state media has been saying about this move. Krishan says that for the past 4 months, it had barely reported on the standoff.
China, in its very limited commentary in the media, was still linking it to the US. It was not directly a China and India issue for them, according to the media. However, now, since yesterday, more statements are coming in. First, there was a statement from the Chinese military, which blamed India. And today, the Chinese ambassador to India has also issued a statement in which it has blamed the Indian troops of violating the consensus reached in previous multi-level engagements and negotiations. The ambassador has claimed that Indian troops have illegally trespassed the line of actual control in the southern bank of Pangong Tso and near Deccan Pass, which is near Rezangla, which was the site of the 1962 war as well. So now the Chinese statements are clearly blaming India. They're putting it as a unilateral action to change the status quo and violating the LAC. While the Indian Army has been quite authoritative in claiming India has not crossed the LAC, the action was a preemptive one to stop the movement of Chinese troops from occupying new positions.
The situation on the ground remains tense. Krishan also points to the fact that the Chinese statements prove that the action had taken place in more than one place.
Interestingly, Indian Army till now has said that there were no clashes, there was no direct engagement, there was no contact between the two militaries, which means there were no fatalities or there were no injuries. However, there are certain reports that are trickling in now which mention that there could have been some clashes and there may have been some injuries as well. However, those reports are not confirmed yet. But the situation remains very, very tense because the troops from both sides have occupied new territory.
Despite multiple rounds of military and diplomatic talks between the two sides, the disengagement has only been limited. And that too, Krishan says, was only done to avoid clashes like the one that took place in the Galwan Valley.
Basically, both sides agreed that the troops should not be in an eyeball-to-eyeball situation because when the tensions are so high, even the slightest action can lead to combat, like, whether it's a hand-to-hand combat, because no shots have been fired, fortunately, on the LAC till now in the last 45 years. But the disengagement was only to avoid another clash of the kind of June 15, when India had lost 20 soldiers and China had also lost troops, but they haven't declared how many. So both the sides had agreed to step back by an equal distance. And the stepping back was also accompanied by that neither of the two sides will patrol the 4 friction points.
These 4 friction points lie in the Galwan Valley, the Hot Springs area, the Gorga Post sector, and the north bank of Pangong Tso. While troops had disengaged from the Galwan Valley and the Hot Springs area, the disengagement hadn't been completed in the other two areas, that is the north bank of Pangong Tso and the Gorga Post sector.
On the north bank of Pangong Tso, the Chinese troops had come in till Finger 4, which is 8 kilometers west of where India says the LAC lies, is at Finger 8. They had stepped back from the base of Finger 4 to Finger 5, and India had also stepped back towards behind Finger 3. However, the Chinese troops continued to occupy the Finger 4 ridgeline, so they hadn't stepped back from there. In Gogra's post sector as well, the Chinese troops have not stepped back to this side of the LAC yet, and both sides remain in a tense standoff over there as well, however in a smaller number. Further up north in Depsang Plains, China is blocking Indian troops from going beyond an area called the Bottleneck, which is 18 kilometers inside India's section of the LAC, and they are not allowing India to access patrolling points 10 to 13. So in these three areas, the standoff continues. Disengagement was done at Galwan and in Hot Springs. Now, with this new sector opening up, and with at least two locations that China has claimed in their statement where they claim India has occupied new territory, this can lead to creating further hurdles in trying to resolve the standoff now. Because the disengagement was anyhow not complete, and now we have two more points where there could be friction.
The reason Krishan says that the talks have been stuck is because of China's very obstinate stance that any further disengagement would have to be mutual.
That is not acceptable to India for multiple reasons. One, because better infrastructure on Chinese side, so it takes them a shorter duration to reach to the same point than it does to India. The terrain is also easier on their side. Second, India was always on its side of the LAC for the Chinese troops who had come to the inside of the LAC. So any further disengagement, which is pulling back of troops, which has to be mutual, will mean India might have to abandon some of its established posts. So India cannot do that. India is not ready to accept that. India has been demanding the status quo ante as of end of April, which is that the troops should go back to their original positions where they were as of April end. And this is not just at the sites where there was a standoff or where the standoff continues or where there's friction or where there was an eyeball-to-eyeball situation. Apart from these situations where there are a number of troops, it is the military buildup in the depth areas, which China had started and which is mirrored by India now. That is a larger concern because it is not just about what happens within a gap of 2 kilometers. It is what happens when you have artillery, when you have Air Force assets here, when you have air defense assets stationed just behind the line of actual control on both sides. That always retains the threat of a larger military conflict, which both countries would like to avoid, of course.
However, Krishan points out that Chief of Defence Staff General Bipin Rawat did say a few days ago that if all options fail, then India continues to have the option of any military action to defend its sovereignty and integrity of its borders. But that would be the last resort, because both countries in their multiple statements have indicated that they want to resolve the situation through dialogue.
However, the army sources say that in the multiple rounds of military discussions and diplomatic discussions, the Chinese have been playing a kind of a ping-pong game. During the military discussions, they say that it can be resolved through diplomatic talks, while during diplomatic talks, they put the onus on the military discussions, which is why the army feels it is actually a delaying tactic.
And in the end, we talk about Pranab Mukherjee. The former president and veteran politician Pranab Mukherjee passed away on Monday in New Delhi. He was 84. Mukherjee had been admitted to the Army's Research and Referral Hospital on August 10 and underwent a brain surgery to remove a clot which he suffered from a fall at his home a day before. He developed a lung infection subsequently and slipped into a coma. His situation worsened on Monday morning. Yesterday, he was cremated with full state honors. Besides Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Ramnath Kovind, those who showed up to pay their last respects at Mukherjee's home were former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, former Congress Chief Rahul Gandhi, BJP Chief JP Nadda, RSS Chief Mohan Bhagwat, Delhi Chief Minister Arvind Kejriwal, and CPI's D. Raja, among others. Mukherjee was India's 13th president, and his political career spanned across 5 decades. During this period, apart from being the president, he'd also been the defense, external affairs, and the finance minister, along with being the leader of the house. Mukherjee was also a staunch believer in secular values and was admired by his peers from across the political divide. Here is him speaking at the Ramnath Goenka lecture in 2017.
There should always be room for argumentative Indian, but not for the intolerant Indian. That would be contrary to the spirit of the Constitution of India to the very idea of India itself. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that bedrock of Indian civilization has been the pluralism and its social, cultural, linguistic, and racial diversity.
In this segment, we speak to veteran journalist Kumi Kapoor about what made Mukherjee stand apart from so many others and discuss the highlights of his career. Kumi, Pranab Mukherjee's political career spanned over 5 decades. What were some of the biggest highlights of his career?
The thing about Pranab Mukherjee did so many things over the years that one thing alone does not stick out. Of course, people, when they think of Pranab Mukherjee, talk about the civil nuclear deal, which he had a great role along with Manmohan Singh. Then there was politically, he came to the help of his party so often. One of the most memorable occasions is when he ensured that Sonia Gandhi was made president of the party at a time when the then president of the party, Sitaram Kesari, was actually not willing to step down. Since he had held all the major portfolios, he has passed enormous number of bills which have far-reaching consequences. He knew Parliament like the back of his hand, the laws, the rules. And of course, one of his highlights is becoming president of India, which was a very fitting tribute at the end of his life.
Despite having the experience that you mentioned, and perhaps even having the ambition for it, he never became the prime minister, which is, now that he's passed away, people are talking about. What do we know about why that could not happen?
Well, that is really the tragedy of his life, because he should have had everything going for him. But let's face it, in the party that he was not a Gandhi. So the first time around, he lost out when Mrs. Gandhi passed away. He was by far the most qualified and the senior most minister. After all, he was there from the time of Indira Gandhi. Before the emergency, even he was a minister. So he assumed in his mind, I think, that, well, at least they'll make me the caretaker prime minister, and then let's see. But as the way the Gandhi's function and the party functions, he should have known that it had to be a Gandhi. And though Rajiv Gandhi was not even a minister, not very experienced at all, he was the obvious choice for his party. The second time around, he felt really bitter because Sonia Gandhi had stepped down and said she was not going to be prime minister. So then surely he was the obvious choice. But Sonia Gandhi and Rajiv never totally trusted Pranab. They knew he was too competent and he had a certain amount of ambition, which is why Sonia chose Manmohan Singh instead of Pranab. And that was doubly galling for Pranab because Manmohan Singh had worked under him. The joke is that even as Prime Minister, Manmohan, when he met him privately, always referred to Pranab as Sir and acknowledged him as his senior.
And he's someone who was respected and admired by people, even from, across the political divide. What do you think about him made that possible?
Well, I don't think any politicians, possibly to some degree Vajpayee, would get the kind of tributes cutting right across the ideological divide. There's Bhagwat on one hand and the extreme right, and there's Mr. Sitaram Yechuri on the left, and they're paying tributes of a similar nature. Pranab was a mediator, a man who brought about compromise, who never unnecessarily alienated everyone. He tried to get on with everyone. When he ran the house, it was not in this autocratic fashion of trying to push his own way. He was a great compromiser. He knew to reconcile all sides. He couldn't do it for the nuclear deal, but even for the patents, he managed to get the left to agree to some of his points.
What do you think he'll be most remembered by?
I think he'll be remembered as one of the last of a generation of politicians who function in a different way from today's generation. They were much more well-read. They were far more well-versed in what needed to be done in government, far more well-versed on the laws of parliament, how bills should be passed, how the courtesies between various parties should be observed. That sort of grace is lacking today.
You were listening to Three Things by The Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargav, and as always was edited and mixed by our producer Joshua Thomas. Before we go, here's another reminder to check out Indian Express's Explain section. You can log on to indianexpress.com/explain and find in-depth analysis by the right experts. It has everything you need to know to understand the news better and see the bigger picture. If you like this show, then you can subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.